Joel, the situation in Syria is really heating up. Some very disturbing headlines coming out of that region. There are reports that hundreds of people have been killed along Syria's Mediterranean coast. What is going on? What do you know?
Well, first of all, it's almost certainly in the thousands by now. There's a list circulating of 717 names of Alawite Muslim civilians who were killed in the last few days, and that list was circulated on Saturday. It's now Monday, and the killings haven't stopped as far as we can tell. It's extremely grave. Armed forces loyal to the new Syrian government have attacked this region, the coastal region of Syria, where most of the people who live there belong to the Alawite Muslim sect. And this is a sect of Islam that the jihadists worldview would consider an apostate sect, which means they're outside the law, they're outside of protection, they can be killed, they can be enslaved, really seen as worse than Christians and Jews, as some jihadists will say. So this is kind of what we were afraid of 3 months ago when the Assad regime was overthrown by this rebel coalition. The Assad regime was brutal, it was horrible, it killed so many innocent people, but the rebels who overthrew it include in their leadership these jihadists who for years have been preaching this horrible message of Sunni Muslim supremacy. So I'm afraid it's very bad and it is likely to get worse.
So some of the headlines, there's some confusion about the victims. You just mentioned some of who these victims are, this particular Muslim sect. There have been claims that hundreds of Christians have died alongside those individuals. What do we know, if anything, about that? Is there a targeting of Christians going on in the midst of this as well?
Not a systematic targeting of Christians. Personally, I've come across 4 cases of Christians being murdered in the last few days, and it was targeted. For example, there's one apartment building in a town called Banias where armed fighters came and went door to door, and at each door they asked the person who answered, "What's your religion?" And 6 men said Alawite, 1 man said Christian, and 1 man said Sunni Muslim. Only the Sunni Muslim was allowed to live. The rest were murdered. There was an Armenian father and son who were murdered in Latakia, and the father of a priest was murdered. But aside from those 4, I don't know of any other cases of Christians being killed. So we're not yet at the scale of a real massacre of Christians. But of course, if you're a Christian in Syria and you're watching this happen, you're watching jihadist forces massacre a different religious minority, this is a very uncomfortable place for you to be.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate you breaking that down because I think there's so much information out there that isn't confirmed, and people are saying certain things and creating certain patterns that may not quite be happening right now. But what you just said is really important. Just because it may not be happening at the moment doesn't mean it's not something that is to come. You and I talked about this a couple of months back when all this is going on, and to help people understand what is happening in Syria. Take us through a little bit of who this new government is and how they came into power.
Sure. So the new government is headed by a new president named Ahmed Shara, and he was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. So when the Syrian civil war began in 2011, Ahmed Shara traveled from Iraq, where he had been fighting against American troops, to Syria, and he founded a branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And this Al-Qaeda branch quickly became the strongest and most effective rebel group fighting against the Assad regime, against the government. And the civil war lasted for 14 years. It's still ongoing, actually, as we can see now. But from 2018 on, Shara's group was mostly confined to a small province of Syria called Idlib. But last November, they broke out of that province. They overwhelmed government forces, and in just 11 days, they swept through the whole country and took the capital of Damascus.
Okay, so now you have a new government here, and you mentioned Al-Qaeda, you mentioned, obviously we know these are terror groups, and one of the things we spoke about a couple of months ago was that when they came into power, there were all of these claims and promises that they would get along with Christians, that they would handle minority groups really well, that there wouldn't be, violence, those sorts of things. You were very skeptical of those claims back then. When you see what is happening now, what are some of your biggest fears of what's to come?
Yeah. So as you said, when he came to power 3 months ago, Shara promised that Christians would be okay, Alawites would be okay, Druzes would be okay, that all Syrians were just going to be Syrians equally. And for the most part, he's kept that promise. But what we've seen over the past few days is that he doesn't have complete control over his armed forces. So it seems like all this killing began on Thursday when a group of fighters who were loyal to the old government attacked some soldiers from the new government and killed a lot of them. And at that point, the new government soldiers just kind of went on this killing spree. And these include militias that are backed by Turkey. These include foreign fighters from Chechnya and China and Egypt and other places. And there isn't a sense that Shara really has a firm control over his own military forces at this stage. So my fear is that this continues to spiral out of control and there are more killings and there's no one in a position to stop it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the skepticism based on his past, and you mentioned him so far keeping that promise. So it's entirely possible right now that he's just lost control and that he perhaps has wanted to, at least for the time being, keep that promise he made. Would that be an accurate assessment based on what you're saying?
It's a possibility. It's also possible that he ordered this attack. We really don't
Sure.
know. So far, he's made lots of speeches about the violence in the past few days. And frankly, they haven't been very good speeches. He said, anyone who harms a civilian should be punished. Okay, good. But he hasn't acknowledged the scale of the massacres that's been happening. He appointed a committee to investigate. It's not clear what powers that committee has. He says what's happening are expected developments. I don't think he told people to expect massacres of thousands of Alawite civilians a few months ago, but apparently he was expecting it. So it's quite alarming. And the international community really needs to be making clear to Shara right now that if he wants to have a seat at the table at the UN, at any kind of international setting, this has to stop him immediately.
Yeah, so Assad, kind of going back to Assad, because things obviously not being great under Assad for so long, one of the challenges, and you and I have talked about this often, when you have a situation like this where an old regime is pushed out and they've, committed atrocities, they've been horrific, and a new regime comes in, many times the new regime that comes in ends up being worse than what was previously there. Can you speak a little bit about Assad, who he was, how he ruled, how Christians fared under him, just so people get a sense of where the country is coming from for those who don't know?
Sure. So Syria became independent in 1946, and it was a very weak state. It was created by the French, essentially, and they created it to be weak, thinking that they could control it. And instead, it just kind of fell apart, and they had something like 12 military coups in 25 years. And the final military coup was carried out by Assad's father. And Assad's father was strong enough to actually pull together a government that could control the whole country. And his family would go on to rule the country for another 54 years or so. But the way that he brought the country under his control was with extreme violence. In 1982, he killed something like 20,000 people in the city of Hama. And his son was no better. His son forcibly disappeared tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Syrians during the civil war. Thousands of them were killed in his dungeons, tortured, the sexual violence against civilians, chemical weapons attacks. I mean, Assad was a monster. And even I lived in Syria before the war began, and Syria was at peace at that time. But even then, my Christian friends would tell me, Joel, the walls here have ears. You cannot talk about politics here like you do at home. They're very firm with me on that point, to their credit. But because Assad was himself an Alawite Muslim, he had no interest in Islamic rule or Islamic law. So he created a secular state. And within that secular state, he counted on support from minority groups like the Christians, like the Alawites. So Christians in Syria weren't free under Assad, but they were safe, safer than they were in Egypt or Iraq, for example. And Christians in Syria today are very eager to stay in Syria, to have a role to play in their country. But it's an extremely difficult moment for people who have that dream.
And, obviously you're looking at a totally different form of religiously run government as well under this dynamic. What are the implications, just as we round out to a close, of that in light of the dynamics you just mentioned for the people of Syria?
Yeah, so it's still an open question about how religious the new government wants to be. Like I said, so far they've tried to avoid shutting down alcohol shops, for example. They've tried to avoid telling women what they can wear. But there's no doubt that Sharia law will have a role to play in the new government. And it's an open question about how rigorous it will be, how strict it will be, and that will determine whether Christians can actually live in Syria as free Christians, or if they will choose to emigrate and try to find a different country to live in. 2/3 of Syria's Christians have already left the country because of the war. So it won't take that many more immigrating to really put the future of Christianity in this country in danger. And Christians have been there since before the time of St. Paul. So this would really be an enormous loss for global Christianity.
Well, Joel, we're going to continue to check in with you on this issue as new details unfold. I know this is a difficult moment for you and many others working in this space, and we encourage people to be praying for the people of Syria, the government of Syria, for clarity and peace and the truth to prevail. Joel, appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Billy.